Welcome back to People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. We're reading Chapter 12 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Reading about the Spanish-American War. And I'm going to reread the last paragraph from the last episode just to kind of catch you up because I had to stop in the middle of something. At a certain point in that spring, both McKinley and the business community began to see that their object to get Spain out of Cuba could not be accomplished without war, and that their accompanying object, the securing of American military and economic influence in Cuba, could not be left to the Cuban rebels, but could be ensured only by U.S. intervention. The New York Commercial Advertiser, at first against war, by March 10th asked intervention in Cuba for humanity and love of freedom, and above all, the desire that the commerce and industry of every part of the world shall have full freedom of development in the whole world's interest. Freedom of development means American development, right? Before this, Congress had passed the Teller Amendment, pledging the United States not to annex Cuba. It was initiated and supported by those people who were interested in Cuban independence and opposed to American imperialism, and also by business people who saw the open door as sufficient and military intervention unnecessary. But by the spring of 1898, the business community had developed a hunger for action. The Journal of Commerce said, "The Teller Amendment must be interpreted in a sense somewhat different from that which its author intended it to hear." There were special interests who would benefit directly from war. In Pittsburgh, center of the iron industry, the Chamber of Commerce advocated force, and the Chattanooga tradesmen said that the possibility of war has decidedly stimulated the iron trade. It had also noted that actual war would very decidedly enlarge the business of transportation. In Washington, it was reported that a belligerent spirit had infected the Navy Department, encouraged by the contractors for projectiles, ordnance, ammunition, and other supplies who have thronged the department since the destruction of the Maine. Russell Sage, the banker, said that if war came, there is no question as to where the rich men stand. A survey of businessmen said that John Jacob Astor, William Rockefeller, and Thomas Fortune Ryan were feeling militant, and J.P. Morgan believed further talk with Spain would accomplish nothing. On March 21st, 1898, Henry Cabot Lodge wrote McKinley a long letter saying he had talked with bankers, brokers, businessmen, editors, clergymen, and others in Boston, Lynn, and Nahant, and everybody, including the most conservative classes, wanted the Cuban question solved. Lodge reported, "They said for business one shock and then an end was better than a succession of spasms such as we must have if this war in Cuba went on." On March 25th, a telegram arrived at the White House from an advisor to McKinley saying, "Big corporations here now believe we will have war. Believe all would welcome it as relief to suspense." Missing the pronouns. Believe all would welcome it as to relief to suspense. 2 days after getting this telegram, McKinley presented an ultimatum to Spain, demanding an armistice. He said nothing about independence for Cuba. A spokesman for the Cuban rebels, part of a group of Cubans in New York, interpreted this to mean the U.S. simply wanted to replace Spain. he responded, "In the face of the present proposal of intervention without previous recognition of independence, it is necessary for us to go a step farther and say that we must and will regard such intervention as nothing less than a declaration of war by the United States against the Cuban revolutionists." Indeed, when McKinley asked Congress for war on April 11th, he did not recognize the rebels as belligerents or ask for Cuban independence. 9 days later, Congress, by joint resolution, gave McKinley the power to intervene. Excuse me. When American forces moved into Cuba, the rebels welcomed them, hoping the Teller Amendment would guarantee Cuban independence. Many histories of the Spanish-American War have said that the public opinion in the United States led McKinley to declare war on Spain and send forces to Cuba. True, certain influential newspapers had been pushing hard, even hysterically, and many Americans, seeing the aim of intervention as Cuban independence, and with the Teller Amendment as guarantee of this intention, supported the idea. But would McKinley have gone to war because of the press and some portion of the public? We had no public opinion surveys at that time. Without the urging of the business community? Several years after the Cuban War, the chief of the Bureau of Foreign Commerce of the Department of Commerce wrote about that period. Underlying the popular sentiment, which might have evaporated in time, which forced the United States to take up arms against Spanish rule in Cuba, were our economic relations with the West Indies and the South American republics. The Spanish-American War was but an incident of a general movement of expansion which had its roots in the changed environment of an industrial capacity far beyond our domestic powers of consumption. It was seen to be necessary for us not only to find foreign purchasers for our goods, but to provide the means of making access to foreign markets easy, economical, and safe. American labor unions had sympathy for the Cuban rebels as soon as the insurrection against Spain began in 1895. But they opposed American expansionism. Both the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor spoke against the idea of annexing Hawaii, which McKinley proposed in 1897. Despite the feeling for the Cuban rebels, a resolution calling for U.S. intervention was defeated at the 1897 convention of the AFL. Samuel Gompers of the AFL wrote to a friend, "The sympathy of our movements with Cuba is genuine, earnest, and sincere. But this does not for a moment imply that we are committed to certain adventurers who are apparently suffering from hysteria." When the explosion of the Maine in February led to excited calls for war in the press, the monthly journal of the International Association of Machinists agreed it was a terrible disaster, but it noted that the deaths of workers in industrial accidents drew no such national clamor. It pointed to the Latimer massacre of September 10, 1897, during a coal strike in Pennsylvania. Miners marching on a highway to the Latimer mine. Austrians, Hungarians, Italians, Germans, who had originally been imported as strikebreakers, but then organized themselves, refused to disperse, whereupon the sheriff and his deputies opened fire, killing 19 of them, most of them shot in the back, with no outcry in the press. The Labor Journal said that the carnival of carnage that takes place every day, month, and year in the realm of industry, the thousands of useful lives that are annually sacrificed to the Moloch of greed, The blood tribute paid by labor to capitalism brings forth no shout for vengeance and reparation. Death comes in thousands of instances in mill and mine, claims his victims, and no popular uproar is heard. The official organ of the Connecticut AFL, the Craftsman, also warned about the hysteria worked up by the sinking of the Maine. A gigantic and cunningly devised scheme is being worked ostensibly to place the United States in the front rank as a naval and military power. The real reason is that the capitalists will have the whole thing, and when any working men dare to ask for the living wage, they will be shot down like dogs in the street. Some unions, like the United Mine Workers, called for U.S. intervention after the sinking of the Maine, but most were against the war. The treasurer of the American Longshoremen's Union, Bolton Hall, wrote a peace appeal to labor, which was widely circulated. If there is a war, you will furnish the corpses and the taxes, and others will get the glory. Speculators will make money out of it. That is, out of you. Men will get high prices for inferior supplies, leaky boats, for shoddy clothes and pasteboard shoes, and you will have to pay the bill, and the only satisfaction you will get is the privilege of hating your Spanish fellow workmen, who are really your brothers, and who have had as little to do with the wrongs of Cuba as you have. Well said. I wasn't even there, but that, well said. Socialists opposed the war. One exception was the Jewish Daily Forward. The People. One exception was the Jewish Daily Forward. The People, newspaper of the Socialist Labor Party, called the issue of Cuban freedom a pretext and said the government wanted war to distract the attention of the workers from their real interests. The Appeal to Reason, another socialist newspaper, said the movement for war was a favorite method of rulers for keeping the people from redressing domestic wrongs. In the San Francisco Voice of Labor, a socialist wrote, "It is a terrible thing to think that the poor workers of this country should be sent to kill and wound the poor workers of Spain, merely because a few leaders may incite them to do so." But after a war was declared, Foner says, the majority of the trade unions succumbed to the war fever. Samuel Gompers called the war glorious and righteous, and claimed that 250,000 trade unionists had volunteered for military service. The actual mine workers pointed to higher coal prices as a result of the war and said the coal and iron trades have not been so healthy for some years past as at present. The war brought more employment and higher wages, but also higher prices. Foner says not only was there a startling increase in the cost of living, but in the absence of an income tax, the poor found themselves paying almost entirely for the staggering costs of the war through increased levies on sugar, molasses, tobacco, and other taxes. Gompers publicly for the war, privately pointed out that the war had led to a 20% reduction of the purchasing power of workers' wages. On May Day, 1898, the Socialist Labor Party organized an anti-war parade in New York City, but the authorities would not allow it to take place, while a May Day parade called by the Jewish Daily Forward, urging Jewish workers to support the war, was permitted. The Chicago Labor World said, "This has been a poor man's war, paid for by the poor man. The rich have profited by it, as they always do. The Western Labor Union was founded at Salt Lake City on May 10th, 1898, because the AFL had not organized unskilled workers. It wanted to bring together all workers, irrespective of occupation, nationality, creed, or color, and sound the death knell of every corporation and trust that has robbed the American laborer of the fruits of his toil. The Union's publication, noting the annexation of Hawaii during the war, said this proved that the war, which started as one of relief for the starving Cubans, has suddenly changed to one of conquest. The prediction made by longshoreman Bolton Hall of wartime corruption and profiteering turned out to be remarkably accurate. Richard Morris's Encyclopedia of American History gives startling figures. Of the more than 274,000 officers and men who served in the Army during the Spanish-American War and the period of demobilization, 5,462 died in the various theaters of operation and in camps in the U.S. Only 379 of the deaths were battle casualties, the remainder being attributed to disease and other causes. The same figures are given by Walter Millis in his book, The Martial Spirit. In the encyclopedia they are given tersely and without mention of the embalmed beef, an army general's term, sold to the army by the meat packers, meat preserved with boric acid, nitrate of potash, and artificial coloring matter. In May of 1898, Armour and Company, the big meat packing company of Chicago, sold the Army 500,000 pounds of beef, which had been sent to Liverpool a year earlier and had been returned. Oh man. This is not going to end well. 2 months later, an Army inspector tested the Armour meat, which had been stamped and approved by an inspector of the Bureau of Animal Industry, and found 751 cases containing rotten meat. Shocker! In the first 60 cases he opened, he found 13 tins already burst, the effervescent putrid contents of which were distributed all over the cases. Ew. The description comes from the report of the Commission to investigate the conduct of the War Department in the war with Spain, made to the Senate in 1900. Thousands of soldiers got food poisoning. There are no figures on how many of the 5,000 non-combatant deaths were caused by that. The Spanish forces were defeated in 3 months. In what John Hay, the American Secretary of State, later called a splendid little war. The American military pretended that the Cuban rebel army did not exist. When the Spanish surrendered, no Cuban was allowed to confer on the surrender or to sign it. General William Shafter said no armed rebels could enter the city of Santiago, and told the Cuban rebel leader, General Calixto Garcia, that not Cubans but the old Spanish civil authorities would remain in charge of the municipal offices in Santiago. American historians have generally ignored the role of the Cuban rebels in the war. Philip Foner, in his history, was the first to print Garcia's letter of protest to General Shafter. I wonder if that's where getting shafted comes from, this guy, General Shafter. It's a theory. Alright, Garcia's letter of protest. I have not been honored with a single word from yourself informing me about the negotiations for peace or the terms of the capitulation by the Spaniards. When the question arises of appointing authorities in Santiago de Cuba, I cannot see but with the deepest regret that such authorities are not elected by the Cuban people, but are the same ones elected by the Queen of Spain. A rumor too absurd to be believed, General, describes the reason of your measures and of the orders forbidding my army to enter Santiago for fear of massacres and revenge against the Spaniards. Allow me, sir, to protest even against the shadow of such an idea. We are not savages ignoring the rules of civilized warfare. We are a poor, ragged army, as ragged and poor as was the army of your forefathers in their noble war for independence. Along with the American army in Cuba came American capital. Foner writes, even before the Spanish flag was down in Cuba, U.S. business interests set out to make their influence felt. Merchants, real estate agents, stock speculators, reckless adventurers, and promoters of all kinds of get-rich schemes flocked to Cuba by the thousands. 7 syndicates battled each other for the control of the franchises for the Havana Street Railway, which were finally won by Percival Farquhar, representing the Wall Street interests of New York. Thus, simultaneously with the military occupation began commercial occupation. The Lumbermen's Review, spokesman for the lumber industry, and in the midst of the war, reported, the moment Spain drops the reins of government in Cuba, the moment will arrive for American lumber interests to move into the island for the products of Cuban forests. Cuba still possesses 10 million acres of virgin forest abounding in valuable timber, nearly every foot of which would be saleable in the United States and bring high prices. Let's end our episode there. Thanks for joining me. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button if you enjoyed the reading. Hit the notification bell as well and you'll be notified when I make a video. Also, YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people, and so that notification bell is useful for that reason as well. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.